Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. As Pierre has very kindly said, my name is Sally, and if anybody wants to get hold of me, you may have noticed that I'm in disguise from the 2 photos that you've seen of me so far, so please don't be deceived by the hair. But you can tweet at me, or my email address is up there, or please do come and have a chat afterwards. But yeah, my job title is a weird one, because as Pierre's kind of said, I am a bit of a generalist, and that can be quite difficult sometimes in terms of describing what I do. And I've come up with the job title at the moment of technical consultant, which is utterly meaningless. But I do work with kind of discovery and planning-based activities, trying to put together kind of solutions architecture for projects. And I do sort of more general digital strategy as well. But the main thing that I really care about is helping people to understand how technology can really help with some of their problems. And what I want to talk to you about today is pretty much that, but I want to talk to you about 3 laws in particular that I think can really help with all of your digital projects. And I'm especially going to look at how this applies to the front end, because that's why we're all here. But when I say 3 laws, you might actually be thinking of these if you're a bit of a nerd like me. And for those who don't know, these are a set of rules which were drawn up by a science fiction author called Isaac Asimov. And my rules, sadly, aren't quite as exciting as these. But we're going to come back to them in a little bit, because I think that they're actually really relevant. But before it might be quite difficult, but yeah, before I kind of talk about the first one, I just want to ask a couple of questions. So, who here, I have to come forward, who here would call themselves a developer? Okay, yeah, quite a lot of you. And are there any people here who would classify themselves as like a user experience designer or architect or something like that, something with UX in the title? Okay. And did anybody put your hands up for both of those? Cool, few of you scattered around. That's really interesting for me to know, actually, because the reason I ask is that my work often crosses into that sort of area. So I am a technical consultant, but I work with a lot of UX agencies in particular. And the reason for this is things like there might be projects that have quite a lot of complexities around things like maybe integrating different systems, or maybe working with legacy elements that need investigating. And sometimes agencies don't necessarily have people with the right skill sets to look at the technical stuff that needs investigating. So I really love this work, because for me, technology is part of user experience, and also UX plays its part in technology. And this is my first point, and it's one that I think is really important for developers to consider. And as I'm sure we all agree, there has been a huge rise in thinking about experiences when we're actually making websites. And I imagine that many of you are going to be following things like a user-centric design process when you're actually creating. But this wasn't always the case with technology. Back when it started, computing and programming in particular was really quite elitist, because you had to be really good at coding to be able to get involved. And this really imposing setup, for example, is a computer called Colossus, which was actually the world's first electronic digital computer that was at all programmable. And it was built by the British. The Mark I version was released in 1943, with the Mark II version coming out in 1944. And that's 70 years ago. And over time, of course, what we've done is to slowly make technology itself more accessible to the mass market through the introduction of much more user-focused development. So from there, we had things like the GUI being popularized in the 80s, and then we brought in much more intuitive input devices. So things like the mouse, for example, or this one down here is when we're talking about my school having computers, we actually had BBC microcomputers, and that's something called a concept keyboard, which was actually an early touch peripheral, basically. Allowed you to kind of program things. And these kind of developments really helped to bring people into the world of tech and let them interact with it in ways that they never could in the 1940s, back when we had Colossus. And now, of course, we're in a world where we have Apple Watches and all manner of insanity, where we've got kind of, sensors for heart rate as well as touch and voice and all of these things. And when you start to make technology a lot more usable in this way and more accessible to people, then you get these amazing, unexpected results. And obviously, Minecraft has been in the news very recently, but people have made fantastic things with it. So working computers and hard drives and things like that. And I absolutely love that. What you end up with is this kind of mutually beneficial, almost symbiotic relationship between experiences and technology. So we're making better, more usable technology, but as we evolve it, this more accessible technology is actually allowing more of us to create better experiences, which allow us to keep improving the tech. There's a great quote by the guys at the Government Digital Service in the UK, who included this in a recent article about their design process. And whilst you may or may not necessarily agree with the lack of a need for a dedicated UX team, because that can be quite controversial, regardless of that, I do personally believe that the user experience is actually all of our responsibilities, and it's not just the responsibility of the UX guy. And there's two sides to it. So technology can really enhance experiences, but its misapplication can also hinder them. Regardless of whatever designers or UX folks or anybody else might magic up, if we don't actually develop responsibly and apply appropriate solutions, then the overall experience will suffer. And as with this stat, a painfully slow or buggy process is never actually going to succeed, no matter how beautiful it might be. Or, for example, if our back end is going to be throwing out limitations that our front end has to abide by, we might actually be restricting how useful we can make our interfaces in the first place. And this is the kind of thing that, as implementers, we really need to consider. So the danger can be that we focus maybe too much on what needs doing, but not necessarily enough on how much we do it. And nowadays, it's really amazing to think just how powerful the front end has become, both in terms of what we can actually do with it, and how it can directly impact on the experience that people have. And so you, as front-end devs and designers and everybody else, whatever you do, you're the people who are really making experiences, so you have this great deal of power. But it's never just about back-end or front-end or design or development or any of these kind of silos, because we're all really responsible for the experiences that we create. And as an example of this, if we take, again, for instance, the issue of performance, obviously this is a subject that we're all aware can take up a whole talk in itself, but thankfully I have had that done for me this morning, so I can just skip all of this, it's great. But whilst we know that other sort of factors like the back end and hosting, for example, can have a huge impact on things, as Estelle pointed out, the front end is equally important. So our front end development and our design and things like that can really impact on the success of our site and how usable it is. So we need all tribes working together on these kind of problems and not just saying, oh, that's a back end thing, or that'll be down to the hosting. And part of it is really about doing all of the stuff that we can to be quite proactive. So we looked at some of these things this morning. So designing with performance in mind, setting some benchmarks, optimizing code, using conditional loading, and most importantly, really considering whether things need to be on the page in the first place. But there are some great resources out there that kind of touch on real sort of subtleties as well, and there's a lot more that we can be doing. So as much as we've sort of heard about this again today, there's some great resources out there by people like Brad Frost, Luke Wroblewski, and Harry Roberts, and I'll be happy to kind of link people out to all these other additional things that you could be doing. But it's not just about this kind of quantitative measurement as well. So part of it is also about testing the experience with real people and being able to accept change. So prototyping and putting things in front of people really early on not only allows us to validate our ideas, but it also means that we can potentially measure something a bit more tangible. And your decisions can be changed quite early on if things aren't working out well. So I'm a big fan of kind of getting into code as early as possible to be able to do this. So that's just a couple of examples of the sort of things that we can think about when we're trying to create experiences as well as just websites. And as we've seen, we've come on an awfully long way with technology in 70 years. As technology changes, we have to keep evolving what we do too, which can be really tiring sometimes. And I'm sure that all of us have, at some point, kind of felt that bit of a drain just because it's actually exhausting keeping up with it. But that's why we're all here, and that's why I think we work in this industry, because it's really exciting. And the fact that it does change so much and it's got so much potential is a great thing. Once we find something that works, the danger might be that we potentially stick with it because it's safe and we know that it works. But then if we do that, we could potentially stagnate. And yeah, so we should absolutely make sure that we follow proven methods and that we do things that we know work. But if we never deviate from these, we're also likely never innovate either. And one of the most notable innovations, which we've already mentioned numerous times this morning, is, of course, responsive design. And this was one of the really key developments for our industry, like the shift from tables to CSS, where initially our end clients had very little idea about the technicalities behind all this, and they didn't necessarily care how it worked. They just wanted something built in the best way possible. And so it was really us pushing this, and that's why responsive design has become so popular, because we felt that it has given people better experiences. Responsive design as a concept was intended to help build websites in a more user-friendly way, and one which was more future-friendly as well, because of the boom in ways that we could potentially consume content, and that's only continuing. And nowadays, you've probably got people coming to you specifically going, I want a responsive website, because people are so much more aware of it as an idea. But actually, if you think about it, not everybody does build responsive sites still, and the responsibility of whether or not to build a site in a responsive way is still with us. We might take this as a given, but experiences are still ours to define with our technical choices. And I'm also personally a big believer in the fact that we can be really creative with technology too, and that developers and techies should be part of our creative processes. And this brings me on to my next point, which is one that I think is a little bit of a balance, and your personal opinion may differ a little bit. But bear with me, because it kind of goes into the third point. And the second point is that we can be even more responsive with our work. So traditionally, as we've kind of already covered, responsive design is seen as being this nice, compact little combination of 3 key points. And they've allowed us to display our site content appropriately across a real range of screen sizes. And as such, responsive design has started to feel a little bit synonymous with screen widths, and you can't see a demo about responsive design without having the mandatory shots of all the different devices or somebody doing the classic, drag to resize. However, it's not all about that, and media queries in particular obviously have much earlier roots in helping us adapt to different user situations, so things like print versus screen. We've actually got access to a great number of JavaScript APIs under the HTML5 umbrella, a couple of them there. And what we can do with these kind of things is not start with them, but we can use them as progressive enhancements to make our experiences more responsive. And I'll come back to this in just a second. But if we start by looking at media queries in particular, we can currently detect quite a lot of measurements. So we've got things like widths, heights, aspect ratio, orientation, resolution, but we can go through to things like color and whether or not the devices are monochrome. Whilst we might be a little bit preoccupied with widths at the moment, it's important to remember that things are actually changing. So we've got the media queries level 4 draft out at the moment. And no matter how responsive your site may be in terms of content presentation at different widths, we can actually extend this responsive nature even further. So if we look at light level for a moment, which is one down the bottom, handily with no description, this basically allows us to, as you'd expect, detect the ambient light level around the device that the page is being looked at. So the kind of different use cases might be things, in theory, like being in bright sunlight versus being in a darkened room like this. You may potentially, according to the idea, want your content to adapt to that. So it's not entirely a new idea. We've already got things like sat-navs sometimes dim their screens and change the colors when you go through tunnels, for example. The idea is that it may or may not make the presentation more appropriate for the user scenario. And I'm going to show you a demo in a sec, but as Media Queries Level 4 is still in draft spec, light level isn't actually quite here yet. So I'm going to show you a demo instead that uses the JavaScript ambient light API. However, the second disclaimer is that this is also a draft spec and isn't widely supported. So in order to run the demo, you're going to need a couple of things. The first is a device with an appropriate sensor, and the second is a browser that actually supports the API, which is the difficult bit. So in my case, I'm using a Nexus 5 and Firefox on Android. And if you've ever felt inclined to read specs, maybe some bedtime reading, you might know that they change quite a lot. So I actually had to check this morning before the talk to make sure that nothing had kind of changed in the last week or so, just because I was super paranoid about it. But I actually started putting these slides together much earlier in the year, and things changed. And I wanted to keep this one in, because I think it just gives some useful comparison, because there were previously 2 events that could be fired. So one was called device light event, which captured the light level in units. And the other one was called light level event, which returned one of 3 values based on the banding down the bottom and how that corresponded to the value itself. Except light level event has since been dropped from the spec, so that's why it's all crossed out. So in terms of my basic demo, I'm going to be using the former. But I kept it in because the latter would be more representative of how the media queries approach is proposed to work. So that also is going to be returning one of 3 values. The only difference being that the media queries are proposed to return dim, normal, or washed instead of bright. So that's kind of all the scribbling out and cropping out, and hopefully you followed that. So in effect, we're going to be doing exactly the same thing with JavaScript as we maybe might be able to do with CSS at some point. So in a ridiculously simplistic form, it could be used a little bit like this, where our styles are going to change depending on the user situation. And this is the most basic demo in the world. I didn't even want to bother with putting the code up there because it's so simple, quite frankly. But there is a link to the demo and the code and a bit more information on my website if anybody does want to grab it. And whilst this is such a simple, basic demo, and hopefully nobody's going to just take that and apply it because it is pretty pointless, quite frankly. The point that I'm trying to make is that there are lots of ways that you can actually use technology to adapt experiences and to make them responsive. And so it's not just necessarily about the size of the screen that you're viewing on and stacking your content. And the user may not necessarily even be aware of what we're doing, so it doesn't need to be a harsh change to new styles like we've got here. But it's an example of using technology to make the experience more responsive to an individual situation. And your choice of whether or not to actually include something like this in a development, like whether to use CSS rather than tables or whether to create a responsive site in the first place, is something that I call an invisible requirement. And these are things that may not necessarily get asked of us, but they're areas where our technical planning and the choices that we make can really have this impact on the experience. So if we take, for instance, the assortment of ways that we can use front-end technology to make our sites work offline. And this is, again, extending the idea of our sites being responsive. So they're adapting to situations, and they're providing better experiences. And as much as I love dinosaurs, and I think he's really cool, do we really want to present our users with something like this? Or do we want to let them carry on engaging with our sites in some way when there are actually technical ways of facilitating that? The classic example is email. So if you load up your copy of Outlook or whatever you're using, you can basically do quite a lot of stuff if you're offline. So you can read your emails, write emails, and do a lot of things that you can't do, for example, if you have no internet connection and you hit the Gmail website. And some of this stuff is really quite hard to do depending on the nature of your website. So I don't want to kind of try and dumb it down too much. But there are really different lengths that you can go to. And if this is something that really interests you, then it's worth having a look at the resources there, because there's some great links and some great examples of how you might want to start applying this thinking. Excuse me. So another slightly different example is this. I've been doing some work recently with the Open Data Institute in London. And from the moment that I walked in, it was really, really sad, because I fell in love with this, which is their visitor sign-in book. And that's something that I probably shouldn't admit to in public. But don't be deceived by the iPad, because this isn't some fancy app. It's basically just a website. And it's got loads of lovely little helpful touches in the UI. But the thing that I really love is that they've thought about how technology can give options. So obviously, it's touchscreen, or there's a keyboard. And basically, you can sign in and sort of register that you're there using your email address, as you would expect. Or if you're a super geek like me, you can see that there's a little panel down there. And this basically lets you associate a card so that you can sign in and out using RFID, so just a contactless bank card or an Oyster travel card or something like this. And none of this is actually mandatory, so again, it's an enhancement. But it's all really simple stuff, and it's about using technology to give people this better experience, should they wish to use it. And what you start to realize is that on the technical side, these are just the progressive enhancements that Jeremy was talking about in the keynote earlier. But the really important point is that it's actually up to us to recognize the opportunity for enhancement and see where technology can make things better. So we, as developers, designers, architects, strategists, whatever we are, we won't necessarily be asked to do all of this stuff. And so we need to be introducing it into our work and making sure that it's stuff that we really believe in. So we should think about whether we can use our technical choices to do something above just getting the job done, and instead actively enhance the experience itself. And this doesn't just apply to our industry. So as humans, we're always looking for ways to make our creations a lot more personal and adaptive to our needs. And there's a field actually called responsive architecture, which goes beyond stuff like software, like Nest, and actually into an area where people are aiming to create physical buildings which realign themselves depending on the changing needs of the people who live and work within them. So that might be dependent on things like temperature or light or wind, for instance. And this is the Arab World Institute building in Paris, which has a glass exterior, and it covers these metallic panels within. And those are actually 240 photosensitive, motor-controlled apertures, and they manage the amount of light and heat entering the building. And so this is responsive design, and it's really technology and design working hand in hand to make life better and responding to situations. And developments like this, they wouldn't come about if somebody just took a brief and implemented it with the same things that they've always done. It's only through planners like building architects, or like us with our digital projects, really considering how to use technology to make our output better serve people, and pushing the limits of what's possible, that we actually progress. We can see this in other industries too. So these are by GE Healthcare, and there's something called the Adventure series, which all they are is a set of themed rooms for things like MRI scanners. And I don't know if you've ever been in an MRI scanner or known anybody who's had to have a scan, but they're pretty intimidating. And the idea with this is really simple, and it's basically just aiming to make the technology less scary, but actually to take it a step further as well, and to turn a really functional thing into a plaything. And they've got a really fantastic quote on the website that says, "In the MR space adventure, the scanner is disguised as a spaceship. Children don't have to understand why the MR scanner makes noise, because they can imagine a spaceship rumbling through space." And it's exactly this kind of thinking that I think that we should be trying to apply to our projects in general. Because we make things that are really powerful and complex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be daunting to people. And our application of technology and how we present it may vary depending on our audience and their situation, so we can make things more responsive. If we try to take these very things that make our work daunting, we turn them into part of the experience, then we get better products. being responsive can be about so much more than just applying media queries and stacking content. And so it can be about these changing needs and adapting to different experiences. However, as with all good story, there is a slight caveat. So technology can be a great problem solver, and we can do some great work to be creative with it. But as with everything, we need to make sure that we don't go overboard and use technology for technology's sake. So we might go into things with really good intentions, but our application of technology might be poorly suited, or maybe it's just our implementation that is bad. So if epileptics would like to look away now, using my previous example, we have this, which just shows how wrong and how bad an experience can be, even a really simple one like that, if we're not careful with these intentions or implementations. And with light level, okay, hopefully it's not going to be bad like that, and we're not going to see all these websites jumping around. But we really shouldn't confuse technology with user intentions and context. So we don't want this poor detection or have detection that is inappropriate for solutions, which we think we kind of assume that we know something about the user, and it ends up causing irritation. So it's, again, the same thing of people assumed initially that because you're on a mobile, you're on the go and you're doing things in a certain way, but actually they're sat on the sofa, and it's that we need to be a little bit careful of. And even further, if we think back to the Media Queries Level 4 slide and all the things that are proposed, the proposed existence of these things is quite interesting, because actually, are they really what we need? Are they solving the problems that we face every day? And there was a great talk by Stephanie Rieger from earlier in the year that you might want to listen to. There's a link down there on this subject, where she asks exactly that. And these are the kind of questions that we really should be asking. So we create websites, but we can also make change happen. And we can even create totally new technologies that didn't exist before, which again can feed this cycle, and it can help our industry to evolve. And things like the picture element, for instance, have been mentioned a couple of times again today. But when we're doing so, whether we're creating just a website like we all do every day, or if we're kind of trying to evolve technology itself, I wanted to talk to you about my third point, which is this. And it's that technology is great, and we should definitely maximize its potential and keep creating, but with all of the decisions we make and everything that we decide to do, we really need to keep this idea of responsibility in mind as well. So when we're planning projects and we come to choose solutions, how responsible that choice is entirely down to us. And some of you might have noticed the talk title. I'm not sure whether we've got any comic book fans in the audience, but it's a little bit of a nod, and this is actually the kind of more authentic version of the quote, which got slightly shifted in popular culture because it got tweaked in one of the more recent Spider-Man films. But the reason that I particularly wanted to reference comics is, apart from being a massive nerd, that within comics, you get these great kind of overarching themes. So one of those is obviously the constant battle between good and evil. And responsibility kind of comes into that and sits somewhere in the middle, because you've usually never got this clear-cut right answer. And it might actually be that there's some kind of balance between people doing bad things for good reasons or vice versa. And I think that we also see a lot of that when it comes to web development. And so when we think about development responsibility, it can be about things like leaving unnecessary elements out or doing things the right way. Or like offline functionality, it can be about making sure that we add certain things in, or just shifting our thinking in terms of how we approach our builds and what we prioritize. And you're probably actually making quite a lot of responsible decisions, even without even really considering it. So all of these questions, like, do we need jQuery, or actually, can we just write a couple of lines of JavaScript? Or should we force a certain experience on a user just because we've already got a pre-built component? Are we actually aware of the best solution to use a particular technology? So, icon fonts versus SVG, what's more appropriate, all of that kind of stuff, really. So we face these decisions really rapidly every day. And these are also the sort of structural honesty and the material honesty principles that Jeremy was talking about earlier. And a lot of this is just about being a good developer, but being aware of it makes us even better. And the choices that we make shouldn't just be based on getting the job done and meeting immediate project needs, but we should also be thinking a bit bigger than that and beyond ourselves. Because rightly or wrongly, I think we've all probably gone into situations and had times where maybe our project choices have been somewhat selfish, and maybe we've needed to get a job done quickly because our scheduling is backed up, or we've used technologies because of our own personal preference and reluctance to change. And I think the point from earlier about using things that are right for you and which sit alongside your own ethical values is really important, because that is absolutely key, and you shouldn't use things that you don't believe in. But at the same time, if that actually causes a conflict with kind of the greater purpose and the project's needs and requirements, then I think that you kind of have to put your own personal preferences aside sometimes, or you have to fight for what you believe in and shift that. So it's a balance between the two. And whilst we need to have confidence in our decisions, we can also sometimes focus on our own opinions too much. And I think what we might have a tendency to forget is that we potentially have quite a narrow viewpoint. So the internet is global, and just like how we shouldn't design for people like us, we shouldn't necessarily develop for people like us either. And when we plan our projects and make decisions, we should really consider the wider world rather than what we just deal with day to day. So we should make sure that we think about things like bandwidth and global network speeds, as well as different browsers and devices. Whilst we should absolutely use technology in creative ways, this should not be to the exclusion of anybody. Part of what I personally consider as being responsive is about adapting, again, to serve a great experience to somebody, regardless of their capabilities of their device or their network or anything else. And similarly, luckily the majority of us don't have to use assistive technologies daily, so accessibility may not always be at the forefront of our minds. And there's been a lot of talk recently about web components, which I believe Peter's going to be talking about tomorrow, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. But if you're not familiar with them, web components will basically allow you to extend HTML elements, existing HTML elements, or to define your new custom elements should you wish to. And whereas native elements often have things like accessibility handled by the browser by default, entirely new ones are going to require that this is thought about by the developers. And so the danger is that this becomes a nice to have, maybe bolted on at the end of a sprint if we've got time. But it's also an example of technology where if we're not responsible with our planning and our implementation, the wider user experience can suffer through us not actually doing the right thing. So our technical choices end up having this ethical impact. And ethics is a really tricky subject. And when I practiced this talk a while ago, I got a question afterwards of somebody saying, how do we define ethics? And how do we define what's right and wrong? Which is really tricky because everybody's going to have their own take on these kind of things. And I don't want to try to define it too much, but I think that it's quite important to touch on. So I've got a few examples. And particularly when we talk about making our sites more responsive to user situations, we can potentially run into some situations where we should consider the knock-on effect of our implementations. One of them is this kind of thing. So I'm sure many of you have come across sites where you get there and it starts demanding information as soon as you've landed on a page. And you don't know if you want to give that information out yet or not. So maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I'd like a site to woo me a bit and at least try and get to know me before just handing over my personal data. But when you kind of try to provide services like this, you try to be helpful, just think about, firstly, whether the information you're actually asking for is necessary. And then, obviously, if you're storing it, you need to think about whether that's necessary too, as well as how to protect it appropriately. And again, we kind of come back to this idea of progressive enhancement. So what's the experience like if we can use things like geolocation, but also if we're not sort of enhancing it with that, what's the core experience? And really start with that. And actually, we were having a conversation at the hotel yesterday about how some of the speakers are really tired of getting the Italian versions of sites just forced on us because we're in Italy. And so you might think that you know everything about somebody and you're being really responsive and helpful and enhancing the experience by doing all of this stuff. But actually, just because you've inferred a little bit of information about somebody doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing the right thing. When we try and be too helpful and go too overboard, it can be really off-putting. And so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, which is the Android version of the Facebook Messenger app. And they're probably trying to be ridiculously helpful with all this stuff that they want to know about me, and they're going to personalize the experience. But again, the same thing applies. And I don't want to tell them all of this stuff. So basically, I get to this point and I just don't engage with them. And that's the danger that you might get if you come across in the wrong way. But it may not be unintentional as well. And this is kind of a really important thing that I want to touch on in terms of, while some of the implementations might just be really poorly thought out, you should also be mindful of when you're potentially going to be planning or involved in creating something like a dark pattern, which is defined up there. And you're intentionally making decisions as part of your planning process which don't have people's best interests at heart, and know that. So if you're a developer, you might actually think that these kind of things may be design problems, but they're not, because ultimately you're responsible for the things that you build. And if somebody presents you with something to build that you don't believe in, then you should push back on that, because we may make websites, but actually we're responsible for people, and so you need to think about whether you're happy to create the things that you're being asked to. So we come back to these 3 laws that we had at the start. When we look at these, I know that this is sci-fi and it's not real yet, but the reality is that we already have robots which are capable of injuring and killing humans. And so I have to wonder, is the problem really with these laws and being, is the problem really about the robots and actually us controlling them? Or is it the fact that we humans build things with technology which aren't right? So if you see something that isn't right, whether that's something simple like, we've talked about divs being used when they should actually be buttons and things like that, or maybe somebody's asking you to make a killer robot, I don't know, then just basically say something and have a conversation if you don't agree with it. We need to not be afraid of actually opening these kind of channels of dialogue and standing up to fight for things that we believe in, whether it's officially our responsibility to do that or not. Responsive projects have already meant big shifts in thinking for people. And whilst it's really hard to make change happen, we again heard a little bit about that this morning, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. So don't just read a brief and move on. Try to actually educate the people that are around you too. However, I am obviously a realist, and I'm well aware of the challenges that we've got, like budgets and timescales and projects where you're already constrained by pre-existing limitations, and just guard that project manager who just will not shut up, pressurizing you to do a certain thing a certain way. And we've all been there. But things like progressive enhancements and trying to build responsibly don't necessarily mean about adding in an extra load of time to build an extra load of functionality. It's more about being really considered in your decisions and taking everything on its own merits. So try to do the right things for the right reasons and fight for what you believe in, because it does go a long way. So whatever our intentions when we plan a project, whatever we talk about and promise we do, it's actually our actions that are really important. And I think that this is best summed up by another very wise man. And this is a quote, and it's, of course, by the amazing Batman. So I think that we should all be a little bit more like Batman, because he's really thorough and he's really principled, and he often has to think outside the box, and he's got this really strong ethical code, and I think that a lot of people could learn from him. And in a similar vein, I was at a conference not that long ago, a couple of months ago, and one of the speakers there had this slide which he very kindly allowed me to share. And basically, his son attends a play school in England, and with all the other kids, when they're there, they have to agree to these rules, which are pinned up. But just as equally, Chris, the guy, he pointed out that you could take these rules and you could slap them around the face of every budding Silicon Valley startup founder, because they still apply, and a lot of grown-ups in tech appear to have forgotten how to play nicely together. And these are things that I think get lost along the way sometimes, where we're all just trying to ship everything and build the best products so that we can be acquired by whoever in the quickest amount of time. So please do think about these kind of things whenever you next make anything. So, to sum up, 3 points, which aren't actually 3 laws at all, because really they are all part of the same thing. And so the more that we view technology as being able to help us improve experiences and to make them more responsive to people's needs, really the better. And our perception of how a website should look and act has changed so much in recent years because of the diversification of devices and browsers and having to support such a large ecosystem. And the idea of experiences that are completely fluid and which don't have a single correct way, as we've all discussed, of being viewed in a browser is one that I personally find really fascinating. And I think that it's only going to get more diverse as time goes on. We're going to have to keep evolving our processes, and it might be really tiring, but we should absolutely persist, because I think that it's worth it, and I think that technology itself can benefit from us doing so. So the next time that you're planning a responsive build, try to make it responsive in ways that go beyond the widths in your media queries and how your content stacks, but make sure that you act responsibly and use your power for good and not evil. Thank you very much.